even as a teenager, I was into games that didn't quite spark fervor among mainstream audiences. I was hardly a connoisseur of cult games, something that has seemingly changed in my older age, but I have fond memories of the likes of Jet Set Radio Future, Gun Valkyrie, Maximo, and today's subject, Psi-Ops the Mindgate Conspiracy, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary. I guess without realizing it, I craved something more than the average blockbuster title. Psi-Ops the Mindgate Conspiracy is, in my opinion, one of the most overlooked games of the 6th console generation. While there are certainly faults in its design, what with it being one of the first physics-focused games ever made, the concept had so much potential to become a long-running franchise. Who doesn't want to play the role of a psychic soldier that can control people's minds or use Star Wars-esque powers to throw people off cliffs? It's wild to say this too, as the game we wound up with has some really creative set pieces that do utilize the game's mechanics well. The early days of Psi-Ops the Mindgate Conspiracy aren't super well documented, but producer and director Brian Eddy participated in an interview with GameSpot in late 2003 that shined some details on the game. At E3 2003, the game was going under the title of Espionage, with an emphasis on the ESP part, though that was obviously changed before release. As Eddy states, the original name Espionage was a clever play on the words of ESP, but while it highlighted the term ESP, it did not get across the idea of psionic powers as well as we wanted, intended to make people think that the game was just another military adventure. If you've played Psi-Ops, you'll likely agree 100% with that statement. Psi-Ops has practically nothing to do with stealth gameplay, and while there are some clever powers that could be implemented well into a stealth title, and sort of have with things like Batman vision and such in modern action games, this game is much more of an action shooter than a tactical stealth title. At any rate, the name change coincided with a surprising delay from publisher Midway Games, which believed that the team was on to something special. Instead of rushing Psi-Ops out the door to meet its original 2003 deadline, the game was given a summer 2004 date so that all of its mechanics could be properly fleshed out for the final version. You can see in an early trailer for Espionage that the delay was certainly worth the wait. While Psi-Ops' visual design is maybe a bit dated, the original game looked positively archaic in comparison. Stiff animations, bland environments, and an overall lack of polish, Espionage would have made even less of a splash than the final game did had it released in 2003. One of the main reasons for the delay, as Eddy put it, is that Midway wanted to ensure Psi-Ops was as AAA as possible. Midway was looking to make a huge push into console games, and, well, you can likely tell how that went considering Midway has been defunct for 14 years now. Another sad detail to the story is that Psi-Ops the Mindgate Conspiracy was basically a flop. It's even more difficult to find sales data for this game, but VG Charts list 290,000 units for the PS2 version and 170,000 for the Xbox iteration. A belated European-only PC release happened a year after its console launch, and there is seemingly no data for that version at all. In total, we can account for less than 500,000 units across two consoles, and with no reported budget, it's hard to say how big of a bomb this game was. While the title has accrued a cult following in the 2 decades since its release, I actually happened to buy the game on launch. I believe I played a demo from one of the official Xbox magazine issues, and it sold me entirely on the concept of using telekinesis to fling enemies around. I was, and still am, a big fan of Raven Software's Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, so getting another game that incorporated similar powers was like catnip for me. Let me fling people off bridges or buildings, and you'll have my heart in your hand. I opted for the Xbox version, as I had the proper equipment to make use of its Dolby Digital standard audio output, not to mention the visuals on Microsoft's console typically looked better. My memories of Psi-Ops are, not surprisingly, pretty limited. After 20 years, I would be shocked if I could recall every detail of the game's plot or setting. Believe it or not, the thing I remember most is the theme song recorded by Florida-based nu metal band Cold. I was a fan of Cold back in high school, and had purchased their 2003 album Year of the Spider. When I found out they would be doing the theme for the game, I was hyped. I distinctly remember an old friend of mine telling me, "This song is better than it has any right to be." While not the most detailed when it comes to lyrics, the song summarizes the setup for Psi-Ops and features a solid chorus that might just get stuck in your head. When it comes to gameplay though, what is interesting is that a few of the set pieces came right back to me as I replayed the game for this retrospective. There's a segment towards the end of the campaign where you need to power down a reactor, and doing so requires dodging a giant electrical field. Another has you turning down fans to suck enemies into them, resulting in a horribly bloody mess. I also cannot forget how janky the early version of Havoc physics were, especially when your character would flop around after being hit with an object. Seeing as how I don't own my old Xbox anymore, I opted to play the PC port for this replay. Surprisingly, in 2008, Midway Games released an ad-supported version of both Psi-Ops and its 2005 shooter Area 51 as freeware online. You can find Psi-Ops on MajorGeeks.com or from the Internet Archive, and it works well enough on modern machines. There's even a widescreen mod available, though it has some strange incompatibility with Windows 11 that made cutscenes break for me. You also need to cap the frame rate to 60 FPS, or else the game will go haywire when performing certain actions. So, how did I find this replay of the game 20 years later? Most of my fond memories remained intact. However, I can understand why the game didn't quite take off in its heyday. For one, the campaign is roughly 3 to 6 hours long depending on your skill level. Playing on hard, I finished it in 3 hours and 30 minutes, though there were a few hours of troubleshooting related to cutscenes. The last few levels are also strangely inept in their design, opting for a bizarre supernatural turn, and then just really lazy usage of the aura view power to hide instant death mines in midair. The game doesn't end on the best note. Throughout most of its campaign, at least, Psi-Ops is surprisingly ahead of the curve when it comes to design. In some way, this game feels like a precursor to the likes of Gears of War or Uncharted in the following console generation. You embark on a super linear path with set pieces sprinkled throughout that force you to think about your powers and make use of the environment to survive. Psi-Ops isn't necessarily challenging, and the enemy AI often stands there as you pelt them with bullets or fling objects at them, but the snappy movement and varied scenarios keep the game feeling fresh. One early level sees you start in a missile silo, and as you would expect, you can grab people and throw them to their doom. That same level also has the aforementioned fan segment, a sequence where you can lob enemies into electrified floors, and even a room where you can throw people into a furnace. It's maybe some obvious usage of telekinesis, but it's damned fun. As cool as that power might be, I think your second major power is even better: mind control. As the name implies, this lets you directly control enemies and either turn them against their comrades or have them take their own lives to get out of your way. The game doesn't limit this ability to just combat, as shortly after acquiring it, you'll need to position your main character on a box and then mind control an enemy to operate a crane. I hate that I was stumped by this for a bit, but then modern gaming often points things out to such an obvious degree that I was expecting the game to flat out tell me what I needed to do. I haven't even mentioned the plot yet, but this is surprisingly where Psi-Ops is at its weakest. Going back to that GameSpot interview, Brian Eddy states that the entire concept for the game came about when some members of the dev team were using a primitive version of Google Earth to try and remote view into a terrorist compound. From that idea came the concept of a psionic soldier, and eventually a story that delved into conspiracy theories about the government researching superpowers. In a weird way, this is pretty similar to the plot for the original Deus Ex, which essentially acted as if every conspiracy theory ever conceived was real. Anyway, Psi-Ops follows the exploits of Nick Scryer, a soldier given psionic powers but suffering from a case of amnesia. Sent behind enemy lines to infiltrate a compound, he eventually starts to regain his memories and with them his psychic powers. As you progress through the story, you'll learn about a cover-up from the government called Mindgate, and how psionic soldiers are trying to rebel against their leaders in an attempt to control the world. It's fine enough for a setup, but there's no real depth to any of the characters. What does help the game immensely is that the tone is very clearly cheesy. The opening cutscene features a giant bald guy who is very clearly based on Michael Clark Duncan throwing an oil truck at a building and some goggle-wearing Japanese man grimacing at the camera. When you hear the voice acting, you'll either wince in pain or laugh in delight. For certain, the story isn't complete hogwash or self-referential, but the devs knew what they were playing with. Psi-Ops is not a vehicle for serious storytelling, and it works all the better for that. Sadly, whatever the ambitions were for the story do not get realized within this game. Even worse, it ends with a giant "to be continued" that is yet to be resolved. In an interview with Cinelix in 2020, Brian Eddy stated that, while there was always an intention to continue Psi-Ops, Midway had determined that the game did not sell enough to warrant a sequel. No story ideas were ever conceived, though new game concepts were discussed. We talked about extending his existing powers, along with introducing some new ones, Eddie said. We also really wanted to introduce more variety of gameplay with vehicles, bigger worlds, more and smarter enemies, etc. As with the story, nothing got further than talks about what to do with a sequel. Shortly after Psi-Ops was released, Midway reached a verbal agreement with Hong Kong director John Woo to create a video game sequel to his legendary 1992 action film Hard Boiled. Most people are likely familiar with Stranglehold, the 2007 third-person shooter that starred Chow Yun-fat, though its connections to Psi-Ops have not been as widely publicized. A lot of the same team worked on Stranglehold, and Brian Eddy even served as that game's director. At one point, the film rights for Psi-Ops: The Mindgate Conspiracy were sold to the producing duo of Adrian Ascari and Chuck Gordon. The two aren't super well known, though Gordon has had his hands in the likes of Field of Dreams, Die Hard 2, and Waterworld. Ascari produced both of the theatrical Hitman movies, of which he and Gordon would collaborate on the 2015 sequel, Hitman Agent 47. The plan was to release the film alongside a game sequel, though obviously the game wound up not being popular enough for such an outcome. So, why did Psi-Ops: The Mindgate Conspiracy fail? Younger gamers might not know it, but 2004 was a banner year for video games as a whole. Among some of its heavy hitters are the likes of Half-Life 2, Doom 3, Halo 2, Burnout 3 Takedown, The Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay, and so on. There are so many legendary games which were released mere weeks apart that a brand new IP in the form of Psi-Ops probably didn't speak to the masses. Most of my time was dedicated to Unreal Tournament 2004, so even though I played Psi-Ops, I wasn't singing its praises as much as I should have. Is there a chance we could ever see a revival or remaster? I do suppose anything is possible. To me, Psi-Ops is the perfect game for Night Dive Studios to touch up a bit. Sadly, the rights to the game were sold to Warner Bros. When Midway dissolved. Considering WB won't even release Coyote vs. Acme, a film that is all but certain to be a massive hit, I don't think we have any hope of seeing Psi-Ops make a sudden reappearance. I would love to be proven wrong, though. Even if a continuation or reboot never sees the light of day, at least the game we have is still worth playing. There are a ton of promising old PS2 action titles that feel exceptionally dated in comparison to modern games. Since the 6th console generation is where developers started to codify control schemes and design elements, a lot of early 2000s games feel absolutely archaic when it comes to controls. Psi-Ops feels decidedly modern, even if it has some quirks. Really, as the modern AAA industry starts to implode and people begin to seek indie games, I think Psi-Ops could potentially be a big hit now. People are nostalgic for the design of 6th generation games, and cheesy dialogue is all the rage. All it would take is a reboot to reconfigure the core idea and expand its concepts so that developers can take the idea in new directions and potentially set the game in any setting they want. I think that would be great, especially with the dearth of stealth action titles right now.